Hi, I'm Gina Tabrizi, licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm here to talk to you about how trauma impacts a life. You know, more and more as we've evolved as humans, we've started to understand really the impact of traumatic events and the long-lasting effect it could have on a human being and the subtleties that happen when someone experiences trauma. They have a heightened sense of fear and alertness and understanding that their environment maybe isn't safe. They're hyper-tuned to other people and their sensitivities, and sometimes they withdraw or they internalize the trauma and they remove themselves from other people. But oftentimes, the subtlety of trauma changes the way that we interact and live our lives in relationship to others. And to me, that's the most dramatic impact that trauma has. The long-lasting effect of changing who I am as a person and how I relate to other people. You see, if I grow up in an environment where there's fear, and I've had some abuse that has occurred, or maybe I've been neglected, maybe I've been ignored, maybe I'm not the favored child, maybe I've been alone, I'm the latchkey kid who used to come home and my parents are out working really hard, but they're not spending time with me. And in that loneliness and in that isolation, I started to fill in an identity. And maybe part of that identity was I don't really matter to anybody, nobody notices me, I'm not significant, and I'm not enough. Many children and many of us grew up feeling like we're not enough. It's a common theme, like I'm not getting it right, I'm not doing good enough. And who am I doing good enough for? Well, I'm doing good enough for my caretakers, which at the beginning stages of life is usually your parents, right? Your significant caregivers. So when you're growing up and you're identifying how to receive love, how to feel validated, how to feel seen, and how to feel heard, the person that you're looking to is those significant caregivers. So if you're in a home or in an environment where those needs aren't being met, you're being ignored, nobody's available to you, maybe you have loud, angry, abusive, alcoholic parents, then you retreat. You go inward, you become afraid of your environment, and most of all, you become untrusting. You don't trust other humans to say and do and mean what they say and do what they say. You don't trust them. You don't trust them to follow through. And this causes that uncertainty in a child that says, then where do I go? If I can't trust the people that are supposed to love me, where am I supposed to go? Well, I want to go out into the world and I want to find that love somewhere else. So many of us ventured out as teenagers and as young adults seeking and hoping for relationships to fill in the voids that we probably experienced as children that we didn't even know we had. You know, I know for me growing up that there was many dynamics in my own home, and you know, it was a fairly safe home and good parents and everybody's here and everybody's trying to do the best they can, and there wasn't a lot of severe abuse, but there was a lot of subtle messages about you need to do this and then you get love. You need to be a good person or a good student, or you need to follow the rules. And when you don't follow the rules, then the love is withdrawn. You have to show up in a certain way. You have to always be presentable, etc., etc. So I had all these subtle messages about how I was supposed to behave in order to get love. And I'm wondering, for those of you listening to this right now, can you start to think about ways that you got messages about if I'm a certain way, then my parents love me. Otherwise, they don't, or they reject me. Sometimes it's watching a sibling who starts going sideways. They start doing wrong things or breaking rules, and you see how your parents escalate, getting angrier, getting disappointed in them. And so you start to think, oh, I don't want to be like that, because if I act like that, then no longer I'm going to get the love and attention and care that I need. Why is it so important as adults to even identify those roles that we had as children? Why are we going back there? And I know that for most people, this is a process that only happens in therapy. It isn't always our nature to look back into our history and try to understand and identify why we became the people that we did. And I know therapy is a really great place to do that and a launching ground for that. But really, the reason it's so important is because look at yourself in your adult life and how has those relationships with your family and your caregivers impacted how you behave in the world. Did you go and seek relationships with people who were avoidant, who weren't available to you, who were very critical, maybe even harsh, who were controlling, who weren't very affectionate, who maybe were demeaning? Think about if any of those characteristics fit the people that you found yourself in relationships with, whether that's dating or long-term, and especially even in marriage, where you make a huge commitment to someone who truly deep, deep inside your heart, you know, isn't meeting your needs, and yet you marry them anyways. Why do we do this to ourselves? We do this because the patterns that we learned that were traumatic for us have not been unlearned. We continue to repeat them because we haven't discovered what they are. We haven't identified that, oh my God, I chose a partner just like my mother, but my abusive mother. Maybe your mom had two sides to her and she had a beautiful, loving, kind, warm side to her. But the side of her that was cold and unforgiving was the side that penetrated your psyche and the side that stayed with you. And so therefore, that's the part of you that you keep perpetuating. You keep choosing people that remind you of the part of you that was unlovable to your mother. And so you keep repeating the pattern of thinking, wow, I must be unlovable. If I keep choosing that and people keep saying that to me, then it must be the truth. Personally, I know that too, that I experienced that sense of not being good enough. So I needed to perpetuate that role. And so in marriage, chose the first time in a marriage to meet someone whose needs I would never meet. I could never hit their standards of what they thought was a good wife and a good partner. And I wonder for everyone, do you ever look at relationships and go back and say, what was my part in it? Usually we're so wounded and we're so hurt and we're so broken, we think, what's wrong with that person? Why were they so mean? Why did they treat me like that? How could they do that to me? And maybe with enough time and distance after a breakup, you can go back and start to think, what was I doing? What was happening to me in that relationship that I was showing up the way that I did? And I was allowing someone to treat me in a way that felt so unkind, so unloving, and so unforgiving. One way is to trace that pattern back to the womb, so to speak. So going back to that mother wound or going back to that father wound, to remember and to identify the things that your parents did and taught you that do not work for you. You see, even today, I sat in the room with a woman who is in her late 50s, possibly maybe even over 60, who we started talking about, tell me about the grief and loss of your ex-husband. And as we talked about it, I asked her to identify within herself, where do you feel that pain and that hurt? And right away she could go to her heart. And so when you feel pain and hurt, I want you to identify where does that feeling reside in your physical body? Because there's a lot of answers about how we carry trauma and how it's stored in our bodies, and tapping into that, we can also learn how to release those traumas. So for her, she had her hand over her heart and she started to feel sad. And I asked her to describe that sadness and she goes, I just never felt good enough. Like no matter what I did, it wasn't right. I wasn't getting it right. And I felt very controlled and I felt like I had to do everything a certain way. And the next question I asked her was, and when did you feel that way before your husband? When have you felt this very same feeling? And she very easily said, well, it was with my mother. In that moment, this patient began to identify that her mother had controlled every decision in her life, what color she painted her room, what clothes she wore, what groups to join at school. She would interfere in her relationships with her friends, constantly telling her how to behave, how to speak to them, who to hang out with, who to marry. She was very, very specific about that with her. And the patient started to sob, and she recognized that she had so been controlled by her mother that she didn't find her own voice and never knew how to make her own decisions. Till the point of having her own children and her own marriage, she realized she was still allowing her mother to tell her how to behave in her marriage. and how to dress her children, what furniture to choose in her home. She never really broke free from that. And in this moment, by her and I together identifying this wound, the patient was able to then start to grieve, to really, really grieve. And I remember at the end of it, her saying, I never put that together, but my God, it makes so much sense. And I feel relief. I feel relieved of that burden. I'm wanting for you to understand that there's burdens like that, patterns of behavior that you learned because of traumatic experiences or dysfunctional experiences, if you prefer to call it that, within your family structure that taught you lessons that you're still repeating, yet they're not working for you. You're not healing, you're not improving relationships, and even worse, maybe some of you are not experiencing joy in your own life because you're always waiting to figure out, what else do I need to be happy? If you find yourself in a pattern of always feeling there must be something more, there must be something else, then there's probably identified patterns in your life that you haven't let go of. There's issues of hurt and pain and resentment and grief that you haven't identified and you haven't let go of, so that you could be free to start living your life in the present in a healthier way and choosing healthier relationships. I think the worst thing is to be stuck in a relationship with someone and going, why don't I feel good enough? Why don't I matter? Why don't I feel like you love me? How come I don't feel like a partner? How come I feel like all the decisions are yours and I don't make any? Or how come I feel like I'm carrying all the weight and you're carrying none of it? Why can't we talk about things that are sad or painful? How come if we have an argument and a fight, you walk away? Why can't we talk about the terrible argument we had last night? Why don't you hold my hand while we're out in public? Look how many things I just threw out to you that are possibilities of things that have happened to you in relationships with people that you've never even stopped to identify. And you've certainly never talked to your partner about it. Why? Because we're keeping these dysfunctional patterns alive. If you lived in a home where your parents never talked about anything, you're never talking about anything. If you lived in a home where loud, angry responses were given and they frightened you, then you probably never speak up. Or you're the person getting loud and angry to be seen and to be heard. It is so important for you to know and to notice what patterns you're still replicating, especially if they make you unhappy. How are you ever going to be happy if you're choosing to live in relationships with people in the unhealthy relationship you lived with your parents? I have one thing that I say to my clients, and I say it over and over again. Marry the best parts of your parents, not the worst. And unfortunately, what trauma teaches us to do, what those entrenched patterns of behavior, in order to survive those dynamics in our family, taught us, which that's what trauma is, it taught us to behave in these coping skills that no longer serve us, that continue to be dysfunctional. So you're living somebody else's life. You're living the life that your parents lived. You're living the marriage that your parents lived. And is that the marriage that you want? I am so happy for anybody that's listening whose parents had the most fantastic, loving, affectionate, sexually vibrant, and healthy, communicative relationship, because you're the exception to the rule, because the numbers are against us. I think the divorce rate is over 68% now. I haven't checked it lately. It might even be higher. That's an absurd number. That is saying that we're not getting it right more than 50% of the time. So we do need to analyze relationships, because when we're not, and we're replicating the unhealthy patterns of our childhood, we're also bringing children into this dysfunction, and we are raising our children to repeat the same pattern we repeat. So why wouldn't we think they're going to be doomed to unhealthy relationships? It's so important. And it is so vital for all of us to seek within ourselves our highest functioning, healthiest, best aspect, best, whole, healed person, whatever you want to call that, to be fully functioning, to be whole, to be complete before we're in relationship with people with broken parts of ourselves. And I know that is quite a task, because we should continue to grow through the span of our lifetimes, but really, as we're growing, we should always be exploring the ways that we're staying stuck, or the ways that we're continuing to bring in the dysfunction of our past into our present. So I'm challenging you to look at now and identify these patterns that I'm repeating that have made me so unhappy, that I'm willing now to change, because I'm going to discover them and uncover them and begin to heal from them.